So this is the new Canon R6 Mark II, and I can't say I expected to see it this soon, but here it is. 24 megapixel sensor, brand new, up to 40 frames per second in RAW. We have 6K video external with 4K 60 internal, and a brand new autofocus system with deep learning and subject recognition. And best part, it's actually the same price, so let's check it out.
Alright guys, so obviously this is the first of many videos on the R6 Mark II. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead. I've got videos coming up with tips and tricks, setup guides, obviously a comparison with the Sony a7 IV, and I also try to answer every comment in these videos, so definitely hit me up if you guys have any questions. And if you hit that like button, it goes a long way, so I really appreciate it. Now the hardware itself is pretty much identical to the original Canon R6, except the top, where Canon has made some interesting decisions, and I can't say that I love them. The power switch is now integrated into the top dial, and they added a switch to quickly move between photo and video mode on the left. But on every other Canon camera, for the most part, the on-off switch is on the left side, and so I was constantly accidentally switching the wrong one. I'm not sure why they didn't just keep the power on the left and make the controller for photo to video, which I do like because it makes switching between modes that much faster. On the right, where it is pretty much on every other camera, that would have been 10 times better in my opinion. And they used to have a lock button, which I never used, so I hated it, and you couldn't really reprogram it to anything else, so it just kind of occupied space on the top of my camera. Well, now the lock is part of the dial, and there are a few times that I turn the camera off, but in reality I just switch it to lock, or I thought I was turning it off, but I was just switching it to lock. I'm sure I'll get used to it, but either way, I just wish I could program it to maybe bring up like a custom C1 mode or something more useful, or just get rid of it altogether and make it turn the camera off too. Now, pretty much the rest of the hardware is identical, and that's mostly a good thing. So nothing on the hardware kind of stands out as exceptional as far as your features and things like that go, but the functionality, with the exception of that lock button, feels great. The ergonomics work well. The viewfinder and the flip screen are solid quality. The mode dial is also pretty easy to accidentally switch. In fact, I actually managed to switch it to bulb mode quite a few times, which is not a mode I've ever used. So a lock on the mode dial, that could have used, but pretty much everything else is standard hardware for Canon.
So probably one of the more impressive things on this is going to be frame rate. So it's still 12 frames per second in mechanical, just like the other R6, although now this is 24 megapixels, so higher resolution. But in electronic shutter, this has been bumped up to 40 frames per second, which is insane. You should pause on that one because this is actually more than the R3. And no, this isn't a stacked CMOS sensor, so there will be some restrictions in place with like rolling shutter. However, it is unbelievable. Number one, Canon, thank you for not crippling this camera at all. Number two is this allows you to get shots that would otherwise just be impossible to get.
So the R6 Mark II does not use the stacked CMOS sensor like the Canon R3, which allows the sensor to read images much faster when you're in electronic shutter. Now that's absolutely fine. It's not a knock on the camera. I mean, I wish it had a stacked CMOS sensor, but there's no camera right now under $4,000 that has that type of technology. But the main reason this matters and why I'm mentioning it is that Canon threw in this crazy fast frame rate and electronic shutter, which is so good, you're going to be really tempted to use it a lot. I spent most of my time shooting sports, so having 40 frames per second was like a dream come true. But with this sensor, you will see rolling shutter in electronic shutter if you're shooting anything with fast motion and straight lines. So for example, if you're doing any panning, if you're shooting tennis or golf, this rolling shutter might be an issue for you. That said, it's still one of the better performing cameras I've seen in electronic shutter. So again, it's not a knock on the camera, it's still performing very well. You just need to know that while having 40 frames per second is awesome, there might be a lot of situations that you shouldn't use it. Now, thankfully, we still have 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter with 14-bit RAW files at 24 megapixels. So this is still one of the better performing cameras when it comes to frame rates. Now, Canon says you should be able to get about 110 images before filling up the buffer. I was typically getting closer into the 90 range for images in RAW to my SanDisk V90 SD cards, but that's not bad at all. I mean, this is 8 seconds of shooting at the full 12 frames per second, so that is really, really good. It's only when you bump that into the 40 frames per second that it becomes a little short at just over 2 seconds. Now, the problem is that SD cards aren't quite as fast as CF Express cards, so it took almost 20 seconds to write all of those images to the card. Now, I'm really torn because obviously it is so much more convenient to just have SD cards, which can go straight into most laptops. They're so much cheaper. You can buy them just about anywhere. But if you're using that 40 frames per second, maybe it would have been better if Canon had thrown in CF Express like the R5, given how fast this camera can shoot. But that still has some downsides, so it really depends. I'm really torn on that one. Another really interesting mode is the ability to shoot HDR images with moving subjects in camera, which I guess is because the camera is so fast, it can actually pull this off. And it worked. I mean, the camera spit out HDR images even with moving subjects without any issues. I wouldn't personally use this, but it did the trick. Now, something I would use is the burst RAW mode, which allows the camera to shoot a 40 frame per second burst, and you can turn on pre-shooting. So the camera is basically always recording images, and it will save every image starting a half a second before you actually hit the shutter to keep you from missing a moment. Now, this does mandate that you use electronic shutter, so just keep that in mind. And you do need to go into your camera, select the images you want in the camera, and then your camera will process the image either as a RAW or a JPEG for you to save it to the card. So another massive improvement is going to be with the autofocus system, which uses what Canon calls deep learning. Now, this is a tech that we're seeing a lot of these days, and it implements something that's called subject recognition. Now, right before I went to shoot with the Canon R6II, I just happened to have spent a couple of weeks with the Sony a7R5, which uses what Sony calls AI to drive their subject recognition. And comparing the Canon and the Sony were very interesting. So as far as the deep learning aspects, I didn't think the actual performance from the Canon R6II was really amazing with subject detection. It does have the ability to select the type of subject that you're shooting, but even when I had like a human selected and in view, the camera could still focus on other areas of the image or other objects. And I don't know if this was like a pre-production bug, but if it lost that person, sometimes it would get stuck on another object and wouldn't always go back to the human unless I just let off the autofocus point and then reacquired autofocus. So for me, the point of having this new like deep learning subject recognition is to increase the chances of a camera focusing on the subject that I'm actually selecting and not other subjects. And in that aspect, it was only a slight improvement from other Canon cameras. However, when the camera did find the subject, which was the majority of the time, I don't want to make it sound bad, it majority of the time hit the subject, and it nailed autofocus even with some of the most difficult tests I've ever thrown at a camera. In fact, there were plenty of shots that I was like, there's no way this camera actually hit those. And I go back and look at my images and it focused perfectly. So to contrast this a little bit with what I tested in the Sony a7R5, I feel like Sony is doing a little better job when it came to subject recognition, while the Canon R6II might be more likely to search for a different object. But once it locked, the Canon R6II is definitely nailing autofocus performance consistently and probably better than most other cameras. Now, one thing the Sony a7R5 didn't have that I complained about in the review is an auto mode to let the camera pick what it thinks is the dominant subject, because In 90% of the cases, I don't have multiple dominant subjects in the frame, so letting the camera decide for those situations would be way more convenient. And here it is a few days later in the R6II, and since I didn't find that selecting the subject made a massive difference, I ended up just leaving it in the auto mode and letting the camera just focus like it usually would, and the end result is just some of the best autofocus performance of any camera right now. So the cameras we had were pre-production, so we can't really gauge the full image quality this early on. Stay tuned for that. But we did get a resolution bump from 20 megapixels to 24 megapixels. And anytime a manufacturer bumps a resolution, I think they need to say to themselves first, do no harm, because I can't tell you how many times we've seen more resolution at a cost of frame rates, buffer, video frame rates, low light. There are usually costs associated with that resolution. Thankfully, I'm not seeing them here. I mean, frame rates are the same or even better with the E-shutter. The buffer can easily handle these larger sizes. Video is still oversampling at this larger resolution, even with 4K 60 without using a crop, and the image quality is looking great. Now, I was able to actually open the RAW files in Canon software, which I'm not a fan of, but at least I could open them. And I don't think this is going to be another level of image quality. It's definitely been a while since we've seen that, but I'm still seeing great performance, great dynamic range. You get a little bit extra resolution, which I really appreciate. And Canon's overall quality on the original R6 was really impressive. And so this looks like it's giving you basically a little bit more of that with a few extra pixels. Now video, this is getting some big improvements, and the biggest one for me is going to be that there is no record limit now, because that was the thing that kept me from using the Canon R6 for video for so many things like weddings, interviews, even my own YouTube videos. And the second biggest thing for me was overheating, and now the R6II can record 4K up to 30 frames per second oversampled without overheating, and Canon claims it can do over 40 minutes in 4K 60, which is good enough for me. I didn't have a chance to formally test this, but I was shooting in conditions that the original R6 would have definitely failed me in, and I had no overheating warnings or issues at all. Now, all of those autofocus upgrades also made it to video mode. So again, when this thing locked on, it tracked amazingly well. So the increase in resolution means that this camera is now oversampling up to 6K, and I think it was 5.1K in the original R6. So you have even more detail. Plus you can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second, either with a crop or with no crop in oversampled full frame, which is huge. And I shoot a ton of 4K 60, so having that in full frame is a major advantage for me compared to cameras like the Sony a7 IV. You're also going to be able to shoot 6K RAW externally to an Atomos recorder, or if slow motion is your thing, you can get 180 frames per second in 1080p, which I ended up using quite a bit because I couldn't believe it at all, but the images in this looked absolutely great. I mean, I was mixing this in with 4K like crazy, and there is not a massive quality difference, even though this is only 1080p, and you can still shoot in log at the full 180 frames per second. So just keep in mind that these files are going to already be slowed down when you open them in post, and no sound will be recorded. Also, the video quality of this camera is absolutely amazing with this 6K oversampling. I mean, I was getting solid dynamic range in log, even in low light. This thing looked great up to like 12,800 ISO. It even looked slightly better than the original R6 in my tests, and you get that same low light performance in 4K 60 since it's also full frame in that mode and still oversampled. Probably the only downsides to me were that you only get 10-bit 422 if you're shooting in log or HDR-PQ. And this is the same way it is on the Canon R6 and R5. So if you're shooting with that standard profile, it's only going to be 8-bit. Plus the HDMI cable is a micro HDMI. And if I needed more evidence that these cables are horrible, I managed to break mine within the first 30 minutes. I don't even have a clue how it happened. It just broke inside the camera. Plus, I'm struggling to even find micro HDMI cables that support 6K 12-bit RAW. Now, there are quite a few new features in this camera, actually more than I expected. So I'll be testing these and I'll have a video on all of these over the next few weeks. But you now have focus bracketing and it will actually stack the images in camera. So you don't have to do this in post. You have new markers and guides, including a 9:16 vertical one, which I really needed badly. So thank you. You have false colors, which I didn't expect to see. The Hot Shoe now uses a new digital interface for communicating with audio devices like their microphones and some new flashes they announced. Plus, videographers, you're gonna love this. So there's a setting in the camera that once the subject leaves the frame, the autofocus system is gonna automatically hold that point instead of shifting to the background until the subject comes back into place. I found that really awesome to use, and somehow battery life got way better. I mean, I shot thousands of images, tons of video, and I literally used one battery the entire day. So in some ways, this kind of felt like a minor update, but mostly just because the original Canon R6 was already so good, it almost didn't need an update. So there's just only so much that you can improve in that short of a time. But it definitely got better, and pretty much everything got better. So the sensor, frame rates, autofocus, video, features. This is now a better camera really for everyone compared to probably the biggest competition, which is the Sony a7 IV. The R6 Mark II has some major advantages for both video with that full frame 4K 60 and for photographers, especially with wildlife and sports with these much faster frame rates and the better buffer. But to me, the Canon R6 Mark II feels like a camera with really no weaknesses. All right, there's one weakness, but it's not really the camera itself. It's the lenses. So Canon still isn't allowing native third-party lenses. So Sigma and Tamron, they can't work with autofocus. So you either need to pick up Canon's RF lenses, and some of those are gonna get really expensive. Plus there are a few missing options, especially with like wide angle primes, or you need to use adapters with older EF lenses, which is not a great solution, but something I did, for example, with the Sigma 135 1.8, because I love having this lens and I needed to use an adapter. Until today, actually, the 135 1.8 IS that I got to test on this trip just got announced. But again, these are not cheap lenses. You have way less options than you would with Sony, and there are a few missing examples that this was one of them over the past couple of months. So please, Canon, change this now. But definitely hit me up with your thoughts and questions on the R6 II. More testing on the way, so like, subscribe. And I debated if I should tease you with this yet, but absolutely something insane just went down last week.